Good afternoon. Welcome to the final session of the Symposium Revere in Perspective, Artisanry, Labor, and Luxury, which is hosted by the Center for Historic American Visual Culture at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton. I'm the Director of Fellowships at the Society and Director of the Center for Historic American Visual Culture, or CHAVIC as we call it. Thank you all for joining us. I know many of you have been with us for the past several days, so I'm not going to go into lengthy overview of CHAVIC and the American Antiquarian Society, but you certainly should go to our website to find out more about the Society and our collections and our programs. This panel, this roundtable, is a way to sort of wrap up the past several days, the past 3 panels. And so I've asked all of our speakers to join us to talk a bit more about what they know, what their topics of presentation were, but also to ask 2 new members, 2 people from the Paul Revere House Museum, to speak with us as well. So I'm going to start just by giving a few instructions about the Zoom webinar format so that we all sort of know how we're going to proceed this afternoon. And so I'd like to ask my colleague Amanda Condek to share her video so that we can just review those logistics before we get started. So Amanda, would you like to just say a few words about how we're going to proceed today?
Sure. Thanks, Nan. Hi, everyone. And as Nan mentioned, I'll be the technical support this afternoon. So if you have any questions about your audio or visual settings, please message me in the chat. And throughout the presentations and the speakers, I will be posting links related to the symposium. And you should be able to save the chat for your use later by clicking on the 3 dots on the bottom of your screen in the chat window. So if you have any questions for our panelists, you can type them in the Q&A section, which is also located on the bottom of your screen. And you can also upvote these questions. And we may try to use the raise the hand function later, which will allow you to ask your question in person. So thank you, Nan.
Great, thank you. Thank you for your help behind the scenes. Always good to have that. So I, at this point, am going to ask all of our panelists to please share your video and your audio. And I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to start by introducing the 2 people who are joining us today whom you have not heard from yet. And so I will give their introductions, and I will ask the other panelists to introduce themselves just briefly. I'm going to start with Nina Zanieri, who is the executive director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association in Boston, Massachusetts. She has been there since 1986. Did you wave, Nina? Wave, thank you. Previously, she was curator at the Rhode Island Historical Society. Nina has served as vice chair of the American Alliance of Museums, as president of the New England Museum Association, and has also served on the American Association for State and Local History Council. She sits on the board of the Freedom Trail Foundation and is also involved with several North End community groups. Nina is on the advisory committee for the Museum Studies program at Harvard and the Public History program at Suffolk. She received a New England Museum Association Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015, and I have to add that she was elected member of AAS in 2013. Under Nina's leadership, the association recently completed a $4 million capital campaign, which funded the purchase and restoration of an 1835 building for use as an education and visitor center. It's a great addition to their site there. That facility was honored with a Boston Preservation Alliance Award and an American Association for State and Local History Award of Merit in 2017. Also a Mass Historical Commission Preservation Award in 2018. So thank you for joining us, Nina. And I'm going to introduce next Robert Shimp, who is the Research and Adult Program Director for the Paul Revere Memorial Association. He received his PhD in history from Boston University for his dissertation, A British Paradox, John Quincy Adams's Life and Career in the Early American Republic. He is a recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the General Society of Colonial Wars John Adams Grant for Studies in American Colonial History, the American Political History Institute Exchange Fellowship between BU and the University of Cambridge, and the Outstanding Teaching Fellow Award, also from the BU History Department. He currently serves as the editor for the Revere House Gazette and the Revere Express blog and Revere House Radio. And Robert lives in Brighton with his wife, Megan. Robert, welcome.
Thanks, Tim.
And so let's just go around the circle. And when envisioning this roundtable, I kept thinking of us all in a room where we could actually be in a circle and talk in the form of a roundtable with an audience. But since we can't do that, I'm going to just go around the room as I see it on my screen and ask each of you to just briefly introduce yourselves. So those of us who were not, those in attendance who were not with us for the past several days will know who you are. So Deborah, you're in my upper left screen. Can you please go ahead and introduce?
Sure, certainly. Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to be here for the final session. My name is Deborah Schmidt-Bach, and I am the Curator of Decorative Arts at the New York Historical Society. I served as what we call a curatorial coordinator, meaning a curatorial liaison with Nan and Lauren and American Antiquarian Society in realizing the exhibition at the New York Historical Society for its opening in September 2019. And I worked a lot with our designers, Gerhard Schlansky and Ginny Yang, and our graphic designer, Kara Wang, because we designed the exhibition at the Historical Society and worked very much in tandem with Nan and Lauren. So that's me.
Thank you. Jenny Anderson.
Hi, I'm Jenny Anderson, and I'm a professor of Atlantic history at Stony Brook University, which is part of the State University of New York. And my particular interests are in the intersection between material culture, cultural history, environmental history, and labor.
Great, thank you. Rob Martello.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Rob Martello. I am a professor of the history of science and technology at Olin College of Engineering. And it's funny, we're a small engineering school in Needham, Massachusetts, very small, only having engineering undergraduates. So it's kind of interesting teaching this type of history to students who are looking at it from a very different perspective and drawing interdisciplinary connections between Paul Revere's story and the different work they might be thinking about doing. And I've been working on Paul Revere research since I was a graduate student, and it's been a real thrill to just look into some of Paul Revere's entrepreneurial activities and some of his proto-industrial manufacturing exploits. And thank you so much, Nan.
Great, thank you. Next, Monica Dominguez-Torres.
Hi, I'm Monica Dominguez-Torres. I'm an associate professor and director of graduate studies at the University of Delaware, Department of Art History. So I specialize in the arts of the early modern Iberian world, especially in the connections between Spain and the colonies, but also I have also had a strong interest in this kind of hemispheric approach and looking at the connections between British, French, Spanish colonies as well. So I'm very excited to be here and learning from all of you more about Paul Revere.
Thank you. Lauren Hughes.
Hi, I'm Lauren Hughes. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Graphic Arts at the American Antiquarian Society, and I'm currently serving in an interim role as Vice President for Collections. I think most relevant for this conversation is I worked with Nan and as co-curator for the exhibition, and also with Deborah to put together the show in New York and also in Wham and Concord. I look forward to this conversation. It's been a terrific week.
Thank you very much. Nancy Siegel.
Hi, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm Nancy Siegel. I'm professor of art history and culinary history at Towson University, where I serve as director of the Museum Studies program. And I had the distinct pleasure and honor to serve as the contract registrar for this exhibition, which was, an opportunity of a lifetime. And so to be able to handle these beautiful works of art by Paul Revere has been such a treat. And I know we're going to be focusing on the deinstallation next week and saying our goodbyes to these beautiful objects. But, you know, I'm so pleased and so proud of the work, working with Deborah and Lauren and Nan on this. Their curatorial eye has just been remarkable. And so those who can see the show at Concord or Worcester, please do. It's a remarkable effort. So I'm happy to be here today. And I teach a class on the history of print in America. So this falls right into my love for works on paper.
Thank you, Nancy. Yeah, it's great to have to be working with you on this project. That's a registrar, critical need there. And finally, Teresa Fairbanks Harris.
Yes, I'm the Senior Conservator for Works on Paper for the Yale University Art Gallery and for the British Art Center. And I've loved Paul Revere all my life. I've treated 2 of his prints with discolored lead pigments and returned them to the original color. And so he's my hero. And I teach people how to look at things, and I'm interested in materials and techniques.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all. And now I would like to just put a question to, I think we'll start with Nina, if that's all right. And you can pass it off to Robert when you feel ready. But for the 2 of you, because our audience hasn't heard from you yet, it would be great to get your take on, first of all, just how things are going at the museum. I know you have reopened, but during these really unsettling times, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the Paul Revere House has been affected and what kinds of questions visitors are asking in recent months. I remind us when you did open, so I don't know how long it's been. It's been a little bit now, but if you're seeing any kinds of changes and the kinds of questions visitors are asking about Revere at this moment.
Well, first of all, thanks, Nan, for including me and Robert in this. We're so pleased to be with this great group of folks. And Rob, of course, is a board member. And Teresa, I've known your dad for a million years. I suspect you were thinking about Paul Revere before you were even born. But for us at the Revere House, we reopened in July, mid-July. And I think for all cultural institutions, this has been upsetting, unsettling, and also energizing in an odd way, to have to think about your institution in a slightly different way, perhaps. It's hard when you are a attendance-driven place like we are to lose that number of visitors, but we also shifted to some virtual programming, which tested us in some ways, both technologically and also how we think about what we do, because particularly I think for folks who deal with objects and historic places, it's so much about the reality of being in the place or seeing the object in person. And it is a different experience than what you have virtually. I also am really so sorry that the exhibit, which is such a wonderful exhibit, had its local viewing really cut short by the pandemic. I mean, for us, that was really sort of sad and tragic. And I know all of you who worked so long on this, it's got to be some tears in the background on that. But we felt that that would be something that would also draw more visitors to the Revere House. Even though visitation isn't an issue for us, we thought that would energize them. But I also want to make one quick point about the fact that every year I would say to myself, this is the year Paul Revere will stop being popular, because our attendance has been on such an upswing for my 30 years at the Revere House, which is pretty astonishing, over 30. But now I'm struck by the fact that given some of the issues of racial equity and other questions we have, will this be the moment when people look at these American icons and heroes a little differently? And how will we grapple with that? Will this be the time when those folks become less popular? I think it's up to us to make the right connections. And I'm going to pass it to Robert now, because he can talk a little bit, I think, about some of our thinking in that regard, but also how that's affected our visitors and what we talk to our visitors about.
Yeah, and I would just also echo Nina's thanks, Nan, and everyone that worked to put this together. It's been a really a terrific conference so far and symposium so far. I've really enjoyed the panels, and Nina and I are both so happy to be a part of this closing roundtable. But yeah, to Nina's point there at the end, it's really been interesting to see both how low the attendance is, obviously, and restarting, but in a lot of ways, actually, how robust it is, and we're actually seeing a real uptick over the last week. We've had our strongest attendance actually each day that we've been open. The last few days since July 15th has increasingly set kind of the new high mark for that individual day. And it's really been gratifying actually with the lower attendance to be able to have far more personalized connections with the visitors than we typically do on our busy days in the summer in past years. So we've really been able to get back to that kind of fundamental aspect of public history of being able to share these rich stories with visitors in a more personalized way. Somewhat surprisingly to me, I would say a lot of visitors are really interested in the public health aspects for Revere. My thought would be that people would go to a historic site wanting to get as far away as they could from talk of pandemics, of smallpox, of medicine, of any reminder of the pandemic that we're going through. But in fact, I'm finding it actually to be quite the reverse. As the conversations come up, folks are certainly interested of the Revere family essentially having a forced quarantine put upon them in 1764 on the smallpox outbreak. But then I think the more interesting conversation point for them is people are really fascinated to learn that Revere himself was the first president of Boston's Board of Health, starting in 1798, and seeing some of the things that he put into place, like quarantines for ships to stay in the harbor islands when they're coming in or coming from ports of call that maybe have a connection to the yellow fever. Revere making suggestions for things like moving privies and digging them deeper, and having these conversation points about public health actually have produced really robust discussions with visitors. And that's been a surprise to me, actually. I thought it would be the reverse. And perhaps unsurprisingly as well, we're getting, I think, a lot more questions about slavery, not just in the North, but with the Revere family specifically. And I think as the awareness of the ubiquitous nature of slavery in the colonies, certainly I think more people are being drawn to the fact that Massachusetts was very complicit and certainly not separate from the slave system as we know it. I think more visitors are becoming attuned to that. So we're getting questions about what was a relationship for Paul Revere and the Reveres to slavery. Did they own enslaved persons? The answer is no. And I think that's actually been an interesting conversation point to something that Rob talked about in his panel the other day, this snippet of a letter that we have, or one half of a letter that we have from 1785 from Thomas Wadsworth to Revere, and seeing that hint of a conversation having one side of it, but extrapolating where we can and in responsible ways for how we can maybe piece together Revere's feelings about slavery and how he's thinking about, not just slavery, but systems of employment and work in general. And certainly Rob talked about that on Wednesday to a great extent as well. So I would say those are kind of the major points of conversation that or some of the points that are certainly being emphasized, not just by us, but by visitors, and things that they're most curious about at the start of this reopen process.
Right. Yeah, that's really fascinating. Are those issues that you find you're responding to then based on questions, or have you been changing your interpretation? I assume you're doing house tours, limited number, spread out and all, but I wonder if you've sort of responded to the kinds of questions that you've been getting when you first did reopen in July.
Yeah, I would say it's a little of both. I think that a lot of visitors come with a very sort of a little bit of Revere that they know, the Midnight Ride, or perhaps it's a silversmith. And I think often it's how they respond to where you lead them. And I think we've been working with our guides, and we all work in the house from time to time, which I think is really important, to sort of talk about where we want to move our interpretation. And we had been in the middle of a reinterpretation plan where we had looked at some issues related to Revere, workforce issues, the notion, and I think that both the exhibit and the catalog you folks did really brought in the global aspect. And I think a lot of visitors are surprised by how global. They're thinking 13 colonies, maybe England and France, and then you say, well, really, it's a world system that this is playing out in. And I think that's really important. And I think we're also very aware that we used to start saying, well, in 1630, then there was a house and that burned in the Revere House. And now we're much more aware of the fact that there were things happening before 1630. There's a native population that we have to recognize and talk about. So I think as we as an institution are responding to being better and telling a broader story, I think the visitors are ready for that by and large. I think they're open to that. And Robert, you probably have a little bit different perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Nina that it's both us modifying. I wouldn't even say changing the interpretation that we do, and the interpretation is fundamentally different now, and I think it's allowing for these more robust conversations. In the past, it would be a self-guided experience, especially in the summer, where our text panels are out, so visitors are being prompted by the text panels that we have. We removed the text panels just obviously for better visitor flow, and everything is now, it starts with a conversation with the guides in the house. So that's allowing for, I think, us to maybe be a little bit more on the front foot on some of the conversation points that we want to convey to visitors, but that's also allowing more, prompting questions from the visitors, and they're interacting with at least 3 different guides on site, outside on the first level of the Revere House, which touches the first level for those folks that maybe haven't visited before, or it's been a little while. The first room takes you into a 1790s kitchen for the Revere family, but then you go back in time in the next room to a hall that very much takes you back into 1680. So you're asking a lot of questions immediately in terms of what does 1680 Boston look like? What sort of lifestyle did the Howards have? And we know Robert Howard owned at least one enslaved individual, a man named Samuel, who lived in the house with the Howards. So you have all of these prompting questions just from the physical site that I think in a lot of ways we didn't have a chance to get into previously, or have, I guess, as strong of conversations about previously, just given the more ephemeral nature of people working through the site. But now we have actually more time and more contact. So it really, I think, allows for, ultimately, I think, a better visitor experience, and certainly a better experience for us to be able to tell a lot of, more complex stories. And I would definitely just finally echo Nina's comment about the global nature of the house of Boston, and what are the implications and ramifications of that.
Thank you. Do any of the panelists want to ask a question or bring it in response to Nina? Yeah, Deborah.
Sure. To Nina and Robert, one of the things that I found so remarkable while the exhibit was open at the New York Historical Society is that many of our visitors, particularly school children and groups of school children, the story and learning that Paul Revere was an immigrant really resonated for them. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you're finding as well with your visitors.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We do a lot of work with the Boston Public Schools, and they are probably our most diverse audience. And we often will have kids come in, kids of all shapes and sizes and racial groups, and they're surprised that the home of a famous person is so small. And they think, well, I live in a small house. This famous guy lives in a small house. So they're not seeing the home of a Newport mansion. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is that people are both surprised that Revere has a mixed background, mixed as in English and French. And again, he's this heroic guy. And then you discover that he's got this sort of, his family was new to the country, his father was new to the country. And I think that resonates. And I do think that Paul Revere, sort of the eminently middle-class guy, is part of why he's retained his popularity. As trite as it seems, it's that bootstraps kind of story, which I hope we always find attractive. So yeah, I think that people do find him approachable for so many reasons.
Yeah, I would agree on the point of his father being an immigrant, and then Paul Revere, at least on the paternal side, being a first-generation American. As a side note, for a shameless plug, we do have an upcoming Revere House radio episode coming on the Reveres connection to the family. So this is something that I do think is actually being flagged by visitors a lot more. And I think the name change is endlessly fascinating for people as well. I think, Paul said, with regard to his father, he changed the name, quote, merely on account that the Bumpkins could pronounce it easier. So you get a lot of these questions, and conversation points can come from that. And I think with the second room in the house that I mentioned as well, it's again, it's set to 17th century Robert Howard. We talked about the Howard's experience, but of course the house has a much longer history than even Revere. And I think that's really been something I think that resonates with visitors a lot too, that this is a house that I say likely in the thousands, we're in the numbers in the low thousands of people called that house home over the 19th century, when it was primarily a boarding house, first to the sailors, and then kind of for the North End, these different waves of immigration patterns from Irish to Eastern European Jewish, and then finally to, kind of the Italian American neighborhood that people see today. But that's really been a major touchstone for, I think, a lot of the visitors, and a question that connects not just to the Revere story, which in a lot of ways is something that we can make that connection just with the name alone, but then to that really robust 19th century story, and not just in the North End, but in Boston as well.
That's great. I mean, you just, I think, answered a question that Wayne Curtis has, who was on the staff, I guess, at the Revere House from 1984 to 86, asking if there's been more emphasis on the subsequent history of the site, especially as the North End became the home of many different immigrant waves, and the history of the association itself, and its original founding as a tool of teaching Americanism to these new immigrants. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I think it sounds like you are doing that.
Yeah, and it's something that really started quite some time ago, and I think that it's also because we have a very strong relationship with the North End community, and it's a story that they want to hear about. We had a woman come in and point to a picture that was on display of Mr. Gaduti out in front of the Revere House, and she said that's my, I guess, great grandfather it was at the time, and she said, why do you have that picture out? And we said, well, his story is as important as Paul Revere's story in many ways, because he has this connection to the house. And she was so both thrilled and thrown by the fact that I would say that her story was as important as Paul Revere. So I think that it's part of that messaging about other voices and other people, and not just the hero. And Revere is the mechanism that allows us to then tell those other stories. The house is saved for Paul, but it allows us to tell other stories. And one thing I've always been struck by, Pauline Revere Thayer, who was so helpful in funding the restoration, she lost her father in the Civil War, and she knew that by saving the home of Paul Revere, she would also save her father's story. Because we talk about that Civil War story. So she was whether she did it consciously or not, the impact was that she was able to save those two stories and honor her father and her uncle at the same time.
Does anyone else want to jump in at this point to add to what's already been said before we go to other questions? Sure, Nancy.
I just sort of like to make a comment for those of you who are in museums and working with these objects from my side of the fence in terms of somebody who teaches museum studies and working with students. And so the amazing way in which museums have responded to this crisis has allowed for some educational opportunities that didn't exist before. So things like anything from the programming that you're offering allows my students in Baltimore to be present in New York or in Boston, and those are invaluable. Or the ways in which that you've created online or virtual tours of exhibitions. These have provided an access that we didn't have before, and so, you know, it's kind of recrafting academic projects for students. This has been that kind of blessing in disguise. So this is my sort of collective thank you to all of you who are working so hard and at a moment's notice really had to think, how do we engage with individuals who can't walk through our doors? And the result in terms of the user end of it, from what my students say, is they're fascinated. And I think in some regards, they're getting more experience, and their interest is becoming broader and deeper in areas that they might not have developed before because of the way that you have engaged your audiences. So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Nancy. That's really great to hear. Do the other educators want to weigh in at all on this subject? Jenny.
Well, I would just second that. The learning opportunities at a time where we literally had to switch our classes from in-person to online with about 3-4 hours notice at Stony Brook. So we all had to be nimble, and we've been really appreciating the resources that museums and cultural institutions have been able to make available, especially archival resources and digitized collections, which have been just a godsend for those of us still trying to do research with reading rooms closed. But I actually had a question for our interpreter, you know, Nina and Robert. And one of the things that I found in teaching colonial history that really seems to grab my students is the way apprenticeship systems work and the idea of education in the colonial period, and in particular in such a different kind of learning that you see happening within the artisanal tradition. And I'm wondering, are those themes that you're able to explore with visitors at the house?
Yes, and also for another shameless plug, we just recently did a Revere House radio episode on this very topic, actually, on the apprenticeship model and Revere. So I'll answer that. So yes is the question. And I think with all of this is the thread that we're trying to, or this is the needle that we're going to have to thread moving forward. Is we had to make this pivot as all of you with educators had to do back in March and April. And we pivoted to some of these things that we've talked about previously, whether it's podcast or shorter form blog pieces, and we've been doing those. So now it's the balance of keeping that momentum up, because we do see how broad our audience is now, how many more people, how many more schools we can connect to from around the country. So it's keeping that momentum up while obviously pivoting back to being in person. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity for us, but something that we're still, really trying to keep the momentum going on. And absolutely, on the apprentice question, I think it's really a one that connects obviously to Paul's father's story. So the immigrant experience of Paul Revere coming over and working through the apprentice model, and then actually coming out, fairly well after John Coney passed away, in terms of having some contacts, but still, working through, the immigrant experience in the early 18th century. And then with Paul as well, I think people are really fascinated to learn that he legally wasn't able to take over his father's shop at 19 years old. It took 2 more years, where we think the shop likely stayed with his mother and his mother Deborah's name, but all the complications that come into this model of education, the lack of formal education for Paul, that he certainly, I think, had a chip on his shoulder about for the rest of his life. But then what that specific education that he had for the silversmith business, the goldsmith business that he had, and then I think as so many of the panelists have been able to talk about here, how he was able to take that and then pivot and pivot and pivot and pivot throughout his life while being a lifelong learner and taking that into, the various fields that he would work in over the course of his career.
And the other thing about Revere that's always, I think, endlessly fascinating to visitors is that he really has 2 families. And the children that he has with his first wife are raised as an artisan's children. The girls don't go to school. Paul is apprenticed with his father. And then the children of Rachel's children with Paul, they benefit from Revere's own move up the economic scale. The girls go to school. The one son goes to medical school. So you see in Revere's children and the opportunities that they get or where they move, Revere's own rise. And that's really fascinating to people. And it happens over a 30-year period. So you can sort of track what Paul is able to do for his children. And people find that pretty interesting, I think, in terms of how his life changes and is viewed through his children's lives. And not that the children, his first children, had worse lives, they just had different lives in some ways. And I think that certainly his son Paul is a reflection of him in many ways.
That's really interesting, Nina, that it's a great point to kind of see how that changed over time, which corresponds with Rob's observations about Revere and his change from artisan to manufacturer. But to see it reflected within his own family life and his children is really an interesting way to think about it. That we do have a question for Rob, speaking of, from Robert Wong, who's asking, what do you regard as Revere's main legacy, if any, to the industrial development in America? And then he also asks if Revere had any Black apprentices in his silversmith or other businesses.
Wow, awesome questions here. And I just loved, I was getting ready to unmute, right, and just thank the two, Robert and Nina, for just all these great things you've been describing. And I love the way you keep using the word connections, because I think that's really what history is all about. And I think why the Revere story has so many, so much enduring appeal is that so many people can connect to this in different ways. Say, immigrant connections, right? Or, his health connections or business or, patriotism or so on. So that's wonderful. But of the 2 questions that I just heard, I think I could answer the easy one first. I am not aware of any Black apprentices, right? So that's one that I have not encountered anything along those lines. I think I mentioned in my talk, I know I mentioned in my talk, the famous Henry, a Black Man employee appearance in one of Revere's ledgers. That was not during his silversmith time. That was when he was working on a furnace. And that's a mysterious line that does not have any context behind it, but is very intriguing and suggestive. So that's the easy one of the 2. I love the first question about the enduring legacy. And as I'm thinking about it, if you had asked me that when I was a graduate student, I think I would have said, his biggest industrial legacy must be the product that he made at the end of his life, the copper rolling that he did, because let's look at how difficult that was and how that started in American industry and what it meant for the Navy Department. But as I got deeper into my research, and especially now as I reflect on Revere's story more, I think, of course, that was profoundly important that he was the first American to roll copper into sheets. No denying that. So young Rob, the graduate student, was not totally off, but may have missed some things that old Rob, right, is now thinking about. And I think what's really interesting is Revere was a transition person for American industry. I think that's the way I would answer the question now. And I actually sometimes talk to my students and say, if we were able to move, let's say, Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor backwards in time to Paul Revere's time and have them introduce ideas of factories and scientific management, Taylorism, and all these other concepts in Revere's day and age, they probably would not have had a very big impact. There was not much in place to make those ideas successful at that time. So if you just said, oh, we need to mechanize this, and people say, where do we get the capital to do that? What's the equipment we're talking about? Oh, look at the labor expectations that are here now. How did these laborers shift into that mode? What Revere did was apply his knowledge and just his familiarity, his expertise in the craft mode of production. So understanding what apprenticeships were and how skilled laborers operated, how they expected to be treated and what they could contribute. He was able to take that and shift it a bit into the beginning of the new direction by saying, look, you're still skilled laborers and I still want you to be, but let's routinize your hours a little bit now. Let's work together in this new way, and let's bring some equipment in here and start to standardize the things we're making. He would not have used the word standardize, but bring some of these concepts into play in the context of what was there presently, and then get us that next step forward. And then the next generation, including his son, Joseph Warren, were then able to look at people like Revere and say, not bad, not bad. Let's go farther. And so Revere was this big translation, I think. And I would argue that is something that he did that many others could not have and might not have even seen the need for, to doing that. And to me, that's the thrill of his story. I just think that's great. And I can see there's panelists here who could definitely say much more.
Go ahead, Jenny.
I want to follow up, Rob, with a question. I loved your book. In fact, I had project envy when I read that book. It was so interesting. It just opened up this whole area that I felt really hadn't really been explored. And one question that I had actually was about the sourcing of materials, particularly having studied all of the complexities involved with sourcing silver and the way that it runs into all the kinds of geopolitical issues, particularly during times of war, that I talked about in my paper and in my catalog essay. And I know that some of his contemporaries, for example, were very concerned with promoting American sourced things. So for example, Jefferson promoted maple syrup in order to wean Americans off of West Indian French produced sugar, for example. Do you think that might have been a factor in why he decided to go into copper, since he didn't have any, Massachusetts silver mines?
That is I love that. And by the way, and we can call on my new friend and colleague, Deborah, right? Who I know is very skilled at understanding like sources of materials, of metals and so on. So that's the case. In this case, sourcing materials was one of the challenges throughout Revere's career. I think it was a consistent theme throughout everything he ever did. That's what's so amazing. And again, talking more about connections, even at the beginning, right? We look at, I mentioned to some of my students are making connections to Revere in terms of his recycling. And so they are quick, they want to grab onto that with all that they're worth, and just say, oh, wow, what an early recycler. We have to say, okay, but not for the reasons we would think now, right? Let's not give him some green consciousness, right, that would not have applied, right? To him, like woods are just things that are in the way of other things that you're trying to do. So that's it. However, throughout his career, he would say, hey, would you like some silver? Fantastic. Can you bring me some silver that I could use to make the new silver? So much better. And so with copper working, that was such a challenge for him. He had something that was called old copper, which basically is just reused copper. And my goodness, did he struggle with that. He actually would write sometimes in his letters saying, I apologize for some of the quality of this. I had to use old copper, and there were impurities, there were contaminants in there. And I know at the Revere House actually wasn't there, or was it the Massachusetts Historical Society found a magnet of Revere's at one point, right? And said, oh, what was this for, right? I think maybe it was a child's toy. And I said, no, I guarantee it was to find iron that was like left in the copper that he was trying to use to get it out of there, because it would absolutely taint what he was working on. But Jenny, to get back to your important question, saying, was part of his shrewdness looking at material issues, right? that part, absolutely, the answer is yes. He was looking at the entirety of what he was getting into each time, right? And saying, is this a good prospect? Can I get the materials? For example, for ironworking, the only time he ever tried to bring someone in as like an outside partner was with his iron business at one point. He offered a partial ownership stake of his company to a blast furnace, right? Saying, if you guarantee me a constant stream of iron, I can give you some ownership and therefore some of the profits, right, of what I'm working on. A tremendous offer, right, that he has not repeated. He didn't want to do this, but it shows the profound importance of raw materials to him, saying, if I could lock up this supply, it's worth it. It's worth losing 25% of my company. So for copper, he didn't, he might have had certain advantages, and Deborah, this is where I could look to you to help us with like the Harmon Hendrix connection and things like that. But it was by no means an easy, right, solution to the problem, and probably not as much a motivation for him as some other things, such as purchasers of the need for the materials and his skill set. Those at least are the things he might be writing about more. I'm comfortable making this based on what I've made before. That seems to be a bigger driver than saying, I want to make this because of the materials. Although, like I said, I think you're onto something, because I think it was in the mindset. It was part of the equation. And Deborah, I'll see if you want to add anything from your research.
I would like to add a couple of things. For one thing, one of the things that I find amazing about working with silver, and one of the things that I try to impart to people when I do talk about silver, is that if you think about, particularly in the colonial period, the kind of engineering and the mechanics that silversmiths had to think about in terms of realizing even the simplest piece. So they have to think about heating and chemical changes of the material, bringing in different kinds of metals for alloys, how soft or hard they can make a piece of silver, what other metals and materials they need to bring in to use as a flux. So I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about Revere is that he, to me, is a great example of a colonial craftsman who is actually not just a silversmith, but an engineer in many respects, as well as a chemist. And that's part of his ability and the fluidity of his intellect to be able to take that kind of training and translate it to iron and bells and cannons, which were very, very hard to make. And then, essentially starting the country's copper industry. The other thing, I think that the best craftsmen had that capacity. And, just also another parallel to Harmon Hendrix. So before Harmon Hendrix purchased the Soho property to open his mill, he started by opening in 1804 a small foundry in the middle of New York City. And then once that was operational and successful, he then opened a smelting house where he could start to refine some of his own metals. So it's, again, this ability to have an intellect that can be fluid enough to apply what they've learned about maybe one particular area or metal to a lot of different areas. And that's what's so remarkable about Revere. He really, truly did that from the beginning of his career to the very end.
All right, thank you. Those are all great points. It's really fascinating to hear from your various perspectives what intrigues you or fascinates you about Revere. I wanted to pick up on something that some of the presenters touched on, but just in terms of what we've been talking about, what audiences are interested in, and what Rob just mentioned about what his students think about recycling. I mean, I know that Monica and Jenny, and I think Rob too, in your book certainly talk about the environmental impact of this work. And this is something that happened a long time ago, but it is something that I think is of interest to students. It has to be of interest to visitors. And so I'm wondering if these are topics that in your teaching, I would say for Jenny and Monica and Rob, are things that obviously your students might be interested in, but if you find that that's a way to communicate some of what you're talking about. In Monica's case, it would be the destruction of the pearl beds. Do you find that students are more engaged with the subject when you when you present in the classroom?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. In this generation, I think this has great importance, and it's something that people don't think about, that, you know, these things are finite. They don't last forever, and especially gemstones and destruction of gemstones. And if we think about it, this is as being the same mindset. And the reason why the mindset hasn't changed, I think, is because there was a lot of whitewashing and hiding of what was the reality. And that's one of the elements I wanted to disclose with the kind of research I am doing, is that how people at the time were manipulating the facts and were presenting what was going on in a different way to create this fiction that, oh, the wealth is always there and we just have to find it. We just have to keep going. And well, in the case of pearls, it was funny. I found the theory in one of the chronicles that the pearl oysters were migratory animals. So they just move. It's not that we finish them, it's just that they move somewhere else and we just have to follow them. So they were coming up with all these theories, knowing that really it was that they were destroying the habitat. They didn't have, of course, those words and those ideas back then, but they did know that there was they were causing a kind of impact that was not allowing the animals to reproduce. And I think that happens in many ways, in many fields. And it is important to realize that what we see in the books is not necessarily a chronicle. It's actually the fiction that they wanted to create at the time to project certain ideas. And the students really find that really fascinating.
I think I would add to that that I also try to weave in discussion not just of the natural environment, but also of the impact on the environment of people's bodies. And from the workshop of the silversmith to the mines to the pearl divers, the people who were involved with the labor, it impacted their physical well-being, their health, their the longevity of their career in ways that are being affected both by the kind of labor they're doing, but also by the materials that they're using. And in addition to that, I also encourage my students to think about the way in which these various undertakings had unexpected and long-lasting consequences that their people involved with them didn't necessarily always anticipate. A great example of that would be the mercury poisoning that is, a problem in parts of Latin America right down to the present day.
I could maybe just, Jenny, that was so interesting. I love the bodies connection. That's so valuable for looking at craftsmen and artisans. I think that's, spectacular. I'll just say, but what you're saying really resonates with some of the lessons that my students and I try to draw from the story. You're talking about what in history of technology we might call systems thinking, by saying what are the connections and the repercussions, right, of different pieces of the system and indirect, contacts. And I think that's just a phenomenon. I think you said it quite well. We just try to bring that into. It's very valuable for an engineering student to be thinking not just the direct impact, but the systemic impacts. And I think that's what Monica was saying that as well. I think that's really helpful. And I'll just add to Nan's original question. When bringing out some of these lenses and comparisons, it's really nice to try and get the students to see it as Revere would see it and not as students are seeing it in this current day and age. And sometimes we get into these very funny discussions. They get a little angry at me sometimes when it seems like whatever they want to say, I'm arguing with. So I mentioned like when the students sometimes are saying, oh, Revere is kind of like an early environmentalist, right? And I'll be like, really now? Really, right? And we'll try to disengage, we'll try and disentangle that, and soon they realize I'm politely saying, no, he wasn't. But it might look that way to us because that's how you might feel now. Or the opposite, like just a quick other story is Revere sending his son to England, right, on what I believe is America's first mission of industrial espionage. And the student saying, boy, this is terrible. I thought he was this great upstanding person, but he's just this dishonest thief. And saying, again, really, would he be dishonest? Let's talk about it. And they say, oh, come on, Rob, you're just going to disagree with anything we say. But just trying to say, hold it, would he see it as that? Like, what does he think he's doing? And ethically speaking, would he sleep well at night thinking he's doing this? Like, what's the theory behind his idea of like bringing that knowledge to other practice? So I think it's a very valuable learning tool for students to just kind of say, yeah, you might have that reaction, but let's go into the setting and try and untangle it more.
I was going to say that for historic sites, we have this dual problem of people thinking of the past as rosy and simpler and nicer and everything was great and there was no pollution, to then the opposite of us taking our values and pushing them backwards. So we have this odd weighing that we have to do where we talk about both things simultaneously. So, try to say, well, maybe it wasn't so great back then, but you have to think about, to your point, Rob, what was that person thinking in that moment? What information did they have to make those decisions? It doesn't mean it was better back then, but you have to see it in its own time. And that's a challenge, I think, for our audiences and for the general public. And right now, I think for a lot of things that we're grappling with on a lot of levels.
And I would add to that also is people tend to look at, and students in particular, that we are now in the age of globalization, and that is a new thing. And that's something I want to bring always to my class, that these entanglements and these kind of dynamics have been going on for a very long time. And that we cannot see these different places or different people as isolated. They belong to a large network, and they were very aware. And I loved Jenny's paper when she wrote how Revere was including material on Las Casas. Las Casas was so well read everywhere, and so they were constantly spying or learning about all other groups and cultures and nations, actually, and especially the ones that very important rivals. So there is always this kind of tendency to think that they were somehow isolated, but it's not really true at all.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all great points. I wonder if some of our print scholars, Nancy and Teresa, Lauren, if you would want to address teaching with Revere prints and how, for instance, I'm even thinking about how the massacre print is relevant today, or how students respond to that given where we are with violence and so forth. I don't know, Nancy, you've used certainly Revere prints in your teaching. You are muted.
I start my class with the Bloody Massacre, and I just show them the print. I don't give them any identification, and I have them write about it and tell me, what do you see? And then the next slide is I give the identification, and we talk about how does that change your perspective? And now what do you see? And so from those conversations, it's the elements like Crispus Attucks, for example, right? We move from the macrocosm of this major violent event, and then we go into the microcosm of talking about race in America. And what I find so fascinating, right? So you can look at examples where, in different hand-colored examples, where Crispus Attucks, the tone of his skin has been altered. We look at those, and when it hasn't, and what does that mean? What does it designate? And I find for my students that topics that might otherwise they might be reluctant to talk about. It's through using art, through these works on paper, using Revere's production, that then really opens up this conversation, and it allows for these wonderful interchanges. So that's how I begin my class. And I always go back the last class, and we go back to Bloody Massacre. And we talk about, okay, how has our perspective changed? And the life of this object, build that out. So Revere for me is instrumental in terms of teaching.
I agree with all of that. And I feel, as someone who focuses on works on paper, that prints in general are great communicators. And, you know, it's the pre-photography period. This is how people are disseminating information in addition to books, and visual matters. And I find working with students looking firsthand at the objects when they're available is makes all the difference. I mean, for them to actually see a bloody massacre, which many of them don't know. I mean, I was shocked when I started teaching Revere to find that I had students who didn't even know what the Liberty Bowl was. And this is at Yale. I mean, that's pretty sad, you know. And so I think we forget, those of us who are deep into history, how history has no longer had an important part in some people's educations, and how important it is for us to bring it back, especially at a time when, and I see a lot of this at Yale, where dead white men and historical figures are considered unimportant, and they want to remove them. And it's very sad, because they're approaching things basically in an ignorant way. I mean, we've taken down Elihu Yale's big portrait at Yale, you know, because there's a black servant in it that has a collar. I've been trying to help someone who's trying to protect at Walla Walla a sculpture that my grandfather made of Marcus Whitman, because they want to take that down and put something contemporary there, and they haven't even understood who he was and what he did and how he relates to the college. So I think the more we can engage students in history and how we can learn from history, it's terribly important, because also in art, very often people are principally interested, students are principally interested in contemporary art, which is fine. But I think that having the background of the history obviously teaches them other lessons. And the artists themselves, the contemporary artists, are often looking at the historical materials. Not very specific to Revere, I'm sorry.
No, but does anybody else want to weigh in at all? You know, I've just noticed, I've been so engrossed here, I have just realized we are coming up on time here, in fact, gone past a bit. But I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to weigh in. I've answered some of the questions, just typed answers so that everybody gets a response. Lauren, did you want to add anything about our work on the exhibition? Just in terms of the kinds of things that we tried to address and the kinds of response that we've had from that?
I think very quickly, I would say that these 3 days of programs have been very gratifying, because a lot of the things that have been brought up, even just in this session with Nina and Robert, about space and having space as a teaching a strength of teaching. It's something that I know when we worked with Deborah, we thought a lot about the space and the designers in New York and at WAM and in Concord. How can we help use the space to teach? So I feel like we've touched on that. We talked about Revere as a global, as connected globally, based on his materials, where they were coming from. We talked about him as a networker, somebody who's very aware of what's going on in his industries around the country. And I kind of feel like, oh wow, we actually did it right. You know, I mean, we knew what we were doing, but it's great to see that in the scholarship that all these great panelists that we've had this week have been able, they've been working on this for a long time, and working with you, Nan, for me has been terrific, because I came at it terrifically, right, specifically from the print side. So to have the material culture brought in, the global perspective brought in, I think it made the whole story richer, and hopefully will continue to make Revere relevant to get at what Teresa was just getting at as we go forward, and the use of history and visual material and objects to connect with people.
Yeah, and I think that the sorts of things that Robert and Nina were talking about, I mean, this is obviously something that they deal with on a daily, weekly basis, is how to make sure that that their site remains relevant. And yeah, there's so much more that could be said, it seems that you're doing a great job there, but you're responding to the times, and that's what makes you relevant, and that's what matters. One of the things that we really wanted to emphasize in this exhibition was Revere as a maker, rather than trying to make the distinction between Revere and the ride. And I just want to make the point, because the Revere House Museum was really critical to this. We wanted to be able to show Revere's shop, and they had this great diorama there that we wanted to try to recreate. And thanks to Deborah and the folks at the New York Historical Society, we were able to recreate that. I don't know, Deborah, if you wanted to say a couple of words about the ghost box, but that was a really nice way for visitors to be able to interact and to see the making of silver.
I loved the ghost box, and it was a lot of fun to work on. Basically, what we did was we used the Copley painting of Revere as the initial inspiration, and we tried to create, I guess, a shadow box that would show Revere at work with two other craftsmen, one an older gentleman, a journeyman, and the other an apprentice. And happily, we've created ghost boxes before. So Gerhard Schlansky, our exhibition director, this was his third time creating one, and it came together really, really well. There's lots of good information out there that helped us to populate it and make sure we had all the right objects, and then film it and have this wonderful smaller version of Paul Revere's workshop be available for visitors to look at.
Yeah, it was really, really a lot of fun. And just the tool that you mentioned, Rob, we actually did include that, the little magnet, the lodestone, we included that in the exhibition. Again, it's the only tool that I know that still exists that Revere had. So that's now on view at the Worcester Art Museum, actually, still.
Yes. Yep, it is.
So I want to give Robert and Nina a chance to say any final words if they would like to. I really appreciate everyone being here for this, and if anyone has any final words, but I certainly want to let Robert and Nina, as the Paul Revere people, provide any final comments. Nina, did you want?
Well, yeah, I just want to say thank you to all the scholars, both everyone who's on this panel, but also scholars out there who push us on Paul Revere. We do a lot of research ourselves. We did a great show in 1988 when I first started at the Revere House that sort of set this. We worked closely with Rob, I dare say, when he was a graduate student, and we're really happy with his research. So we like to be an incubator. We can't do it ourselves. We love it when scholars push us, challenge us, share with us, get students interested in Paul Revere. It all really adds to what we do on the ground, but also to this legacy of this really fascinating character. I mean, he is amazing in so many ways, and so utterly human, and so utterly, I believe, relevant. So thank you all for everything you've done, both with the exhibit, but also your research, and please let us know if we can help you.
Yeah, that was going to be my point as well. I echo everything Nina just said, and both for all of our panelists here and for everybody at home watching. You know, as you're teaching, as you're producing your education material, and these questions are coming up with students, we love to be a part of that conversation, especially as we've talked about, with so many more opportunities coming to the fore now with more digital formats and virtual learning. We love to be a part of these conversations where we're happy to to help in any way that we can, and not just help, but continue these conversations and look at new points of scholarship. And the catalog, personally, the symposium has been really inspiring for me in my position, and I just thank you all for the tremendous work that you do and continue to do.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just noticing in the Q&A, Janine Scarry noticed that Colonial Williamsburg owns a small anvil used by Revere. How exciting is that to know? See, this is, we learn things here. So I regret that we have gone well past the ending hour, but I really want to thank each one of you for taking the time to join us today, for presenting your fabulous papers over the past few days. And I thank all of the attendees who have joined us, who have been with us either today or Thursday or Wednesday. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great weekend.